Where's Beacon? Tell me now, or you're all dead. The trauma bay at Mercy General was loud the way it always was on a Friday night. Monitors beeping, a gurney scraping past, someone calling for backup down the hall. Audra Keegan stood in the corner restocking supply carts. Invisible by design. Then the windows rattled. Not thunder. Rotor blades, multiple, closing fast. The doors burst open. 6 men in tactical gear flooded the bay, carrying a soldier whose left leg ended just below the knee. The doctors froze. The charge nurse pressed flat against the wall. The man at the front locked eyes across the room and said one word like a threat. Where's Beacon? No one answered. No one knew what it meant. Audra set down her supply cart and stepped out of the corner she'd spent 2 years hiding in. The trauma bay at Mercy General smelled like it always did on a Friday night. Antiseptic layered over the metallic ghost of old blood, underneath the sharper bite of whatever the cleaning crew used on the floors at 2 a.m. Monitors beeped in their overlapping, a rhythmic chorus. A gurney wheel shrieked as someone dragged it past too fast. Down the hall, a resident was shouting for a crash cart in a voice that hadn't learned yet how to sound calm while asking for help. Audra Keegan moved through all of it the way she moved through every shift, along the edges, hands busy, eyes down. She was restocking the supply cart near Bay 3, lining up glove boxes by size, checking the gauze stock, doing the kind of work that nobody else wanted and nobody else noticed. At Mercy General, float nurses didn't belong to a unit. They filled gaps. They absorbed whatever nobody else claimed. And at the end of the shift, they disappeared without anyone quite registering that they'd been there at all. She had understood that arrangement the moment she took the job. She had been grateful for it every day since. Marlene Baird ran the trauma floor like a woman running church. Total conviction that her way was the only way, and that anyone who questioned it was committing something close to sin. 20 years of charge nurse experience had calcified into an invisible caste system, and float nurses sat somewhere below residents and just above the janitorial staff. Useful for exactly 3 things: vitals, waste disposal, and staying out of the way. She'd made that clear to Audra on her first shift. She made it clear periodically, since the way someone reminds a house guest not to touch the good towels. Audra never argued. She took blood pressures, wheeled out biohazard bags, and kept her head down with a consistency Marlene probably read as deference. It wasn't deference. It was something older and far more deliberate. She'd spent 2 years building it, carefully, brick by brick, since the day she signed her discharge papers and decided the version of herself the Army had made was not one she wanted to carry into a room in daylight. She had been a combat medic for 6 years. The call sign Beacon came from her second deployment, when she developed a habit of finding the wounded in conditions where nobody else could orient, through smoke, through collapsed structure, through the specific kind of dark that exists once a mission has already gone wrong. By the time she held rank enough to command a medical element, her unit called her Echo 6 on the radio and Beacon everywhere else. She'd made calls in the field that no manual prepares a person for, the kind where there are no good options left, only the least terrible one, and it still costs something that doesn't come back. The last deployment had ended on a mountain in northern Afghanistan, air thin enough that every movement felt like death. They lost 3 people that night, not from a wrong call, not from equipment failure, not because she was too slow. They lost 3 people because sometimes that is simply what happens, and the military does not owe you a better explanation than that. She'd come home with a reconstructed left knee, good enough to walk on, not good enough to forget, and a set of memories she managed the way you manage a chronic condition. Not cured, not gone, handled hour by hour. Mercy General wasn't a step down. It was a choice. Smaller, quieter. It asked nothing of her she wasn't willing to give on any given day. She set the terms. She left at the end of a shift. Nobody expected her to be the last thing standing between a person and a body bag. Or so she told herself. Most days, convincingly enough. That Friday had run like most Fridays. A laceration in Bay 2, a cardiac event in Bay 4 that turned out to be a panic attack, a kid with a broken wrist crying more from fear than pain. Audra moved through all of it, neither invited in nor asking to be. She just finished logging a restock when she heard the curtain in Bay 7 rip back and caught Colin Dorsey's voice climbing half an octave in the specific register that meant something was going wrong. Colin was a second-year resident, Competent on paper, visibly young, nervous energy spilling out as extra movement. He was good at medicine the way people are good at exams, which isn't always the same as being good at the moment directly in front of you. The man in Bay 7 had a fractured pelvis and a blood pressure that had dropped fast enough to matter. Colin had missed 4 access twice, and the monitor had started making the sound that means there isn't much time left to try a third. Audra set down her clipboard. She knew this feeling, not adrenaline exactly, more like the half-second before stepping off a curb, when the decision's already made but the body hasn't committed yet. She told herself she was just going to stand closer. Just be nearby. She was at the bedside before she'd finished the thought. She asked Colin, quiet enough not to draw the room's attention, where he'd tried. He showed her. She chose a smaller gauge, found the vein by feel instead of sight, and placed the line clean on the first try. Colin's relief was immediate and unguarded, the kind of expression that hadn't yet learned to hide itself. Then Audra rested a hand on the patient's abdomen, just for a second, and felt a rigidity that had no business being there. His belly's hard, she told Colin, low and even. With that fracture and this pressure drop, you're probably looking at internal bleeding. He needs imaging before anything else moves. Colin looked at her the way people look at someone who's said something too accurate, too fast. Gratitude tangled up with the beginnings of suspicion about how she knew. Audra had already stepped back. She noted the restock on her clipboard and moved on without waiting to be thanked, because being thanked meant being remembered, and remembered was not part of the arrangement she'd built. She was back at the supply cart near the ambulance bay when the feeling came up through the soles of her feet. A vibration, deep and rhythmic, the kind that travels through concrete before it ever reaches the air as sound. Most people would have called it distant thunder. Audra had learned the difference between thunder and rotor blades 3 deployments in, and she knew, instantly, the difference between one aircraft and several. 3, at least. Low altitude. Fast approach. Converging. She set the glove box down slow and careful, the way she did everything, and she stood very still. And she waited. The windows of the ambulance bay rattled first. Then the overhead fluorescents flickered. Not a power issue, just the pressure wave rolling through the building as the aircraft dropped low over the parking structure. Outside, the pitch changed, that distinct shift into a hover, then the descending whine of rotors slowing for landing. The staff around her registered it as strange. Audra registered it as an event type she recognized, and recognition came bundled with a very specific, very unwelcome understanding of what was about to come through those doors. She stepped back toward the wall. Not fleeing, repositioning, clearing the center of the room the way you clear a landing zone, putting herself somewhere she could see everything without being the first thing anyone saw. The nurses at the station were already trading looks. Marlene was on the phone, her voice sharpening into the register she used when she was hearing something she didn't like. The doors burst open. 6 men came through in a formation that doesn't happen in civilian buildings. Not aggressive, exactly, but occupying the room with a complete disregard for every protocol posted on the wall beside the entrance. Tactical gear. Weapons secured, pointed down, moving with the efficient urgency of people who'd already run the risk assessment before they ever touched the ground. 2 of them carried a litter between them. The man on it had a tourniquet cinched above where his left leg stopped existing, and his color had drained the way color drains when a body starts making hard decisions about where the blood still goes. The man at the front was broad through the shoulders, a face that didn't show much but somehow communicated plenty. His gaze swept the bay in one pass. Residents, nurses, the attending stepping in from the back hallway, cataloging the room the way someone does when they've learned to decide fast who's going to matter. Then he said it. Not a name, a call sign, with the volume and clarity of a man finished with preamble. Where's Beacon? The trauma bay went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when something doesn't fit any existing category. The residents glanced at each other. Marlene's phone hand dropped an inch. The attending, Desmond Carnes, took a step forward and opened his mouth around the word protocol, and the man at the front looked at him in a way that ended the sentence before it started. Nobody answered. Nobody knew what the word meant, or who it belonged to. Audra stood against the wall, clipboard in hand, supply card at her left, and felt the exact shape of the choice sitting in front of her. the same way she'd felt the vibration in her feet before the helicopters ever came into view. A fact arriving before she was ready for it. She'd built 2 years of ordinary life on the idea that the person these men wanted didn't exist anymore. Not here. Not in this building, this set of scrubs, this name on the badge. The man on the litter, she'd learned his name was Carter, was already showing the small, involuntary movements that come before the body loses consciousness. His oxygen-starved heart doing exactly what oxygen-starved hearts do. Audra set her clipboard on the cart. She walked out from the wall. She crossed the center of the bay and stopped in front of the man with the wide shoulders, looked up at him, and said it the way she used to, when a situation had been assessed, a decision made, and there was no longer any reason to wait. Move! Rhett Bannon, because that was his name, and she'd known it the second she saw his face. Let out a breath that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite surprise. The breath of a man who'd been right about something he badly needed to be right about. He stepped aside. His team stepped aside with him, automatically, the way people do around someone with authority. Behind her, the trauma bay was still catching up. Marlene hadn't decided what to do yet. Desmond hadn't decided what to say. Colin Dorsey, who had watched her place a line he couldn't find and catch a bleed he'd missed, was watching her again, his expression somewhere past confusion now, moving towards something else entirely. None of it was Audra's concern. She was already at the litter, hands moving down Carter's chest, reading the tracheal deviation, the absent breath sounds on the left, the distended neck veins that confirmed everything the picture had already told her from across the room. She knew exactly what needed to happen. She'd done it in worse light, on worse ground, with someone shooting at her while she worked. "I need a large-bore needle," she said, to whoever was listening. 14 gauge. And a chest tube kit, now. Marlene had spent 20 years building a floor that ran on her rules she could explain to anyone who asked. So when a float nurse she'd assigned to restocking supply carts demanded a chest tube kit, like someone used to being obeyed, Marlene's first instinct wasn't the cabinet. Her first instinct was to make it clear this wasn't how things worked here. You don't have the authority to order a procedure. Flat. The tone of someone who delivered this correction 100 times and expected it to land the way it always had. Audra didn't look up. 2 fingers were pressed to Carter's neck, reading a pulse like she was pulling information out of a source running dry. When she answered, she didn't raise her voice, which somehow made it harder to ignore. "Look at the monitor," she said. "Count how many seconds he has left. Then decide if your authority is the most important thing in this room." The monitor answered for her. The rhythm had stopped being irregular and started being nothing at all. Marlene opened the cabinet and slammed the chest tube kit onto the tray with more force than necessary, the closest she'd get to a protest, and Audra took it without comment. Before she could reach for the needle, one of Rhett's soldiers already had it ready. 14 gauge passed across the litter with the kind of economy that comes from doing this work in places where extra movement costs something real. 2 different sources, 2 different needs. She used both without breaking focus. Colin stood at the far side of the bay, hands at his sides, watching a different kind of medicine happen in front of him than anything he'd learned in a lecture hall. Audra found the second intercostal space by touch, angled the needle, and drove it in. The release was immediate, a rush of trapped air confirming what the clinical picture had already told her. Carter's oxygen saturation began its climb back from the edge. The color at his lips didn't return, but it shifted. That was progress. That was enough for right now. "That buys him minutes," she said. "Not more. I need to place a chest tube where the pressure rebuilds, and we're back where we started." Desmond opened his mouth. Audra kept going before he could fill it. "I know what you're going to say. Liability. Protocol. Infection risk. I've heard all of it. I understand all of it. And Carter will be in cardiac arrest before you finish explaining it to me. So either assist or step back." It wasn't a speech built to win an argument. It was a set of facts, arranged in the order that mattered. Desmond stepped back, not retreat, exactly, more like a man choosing the form his decision would take. A moment later, he stepped forward again, this time to the supply tray, and began arranging instruments with the quiet competence of someone who had, underneath all the administrative reflex, actually trained for a moment like this. Audra shifted her weight onto her right foot, The left knee had been signaling its objections for several minutes now. A deep, grinding ache sitting just below the threshold that would demand full attention the second she stopped having something more important in front of her. She'd learned to budget that kind of pain, store it somewhere to collect later. She drew on the habit now, adjusting her stance so the tremor in her knee didn't travel up into her hands. She'd done this on worse ground, at higher altitude, with less equipment and more noise. Her hands had been steady then. They'd be steady now. She made the incision along the fifth intercostal space. Opened the tissue layer by layer with the blunt dissection she'd learned to do by feel, in conditions where looking wasn't always an option. One of Marlene's permanent staff made a small sound and looked away. The soldiers didn't move. Rhett stood at a distance close enough to respond, far enough not to crowd her. The distance of someone who'd worked beside her before and knew she operated best when people trusted her to operate. The tube went in. Blood and air evacuated into the collection chamber, and Carter's chest expanded for the first time since he'd come through the doors. Sack climbed past 80, past 90. His heart rate steadied. The monitors stopped arguing and settled into something sustainable. The trauma bay exhaled a breath nobody had realized it was holding. Colin was staring at the vitals display with the look of someone quietly correcting an assumption he hadn't known he was making. "Get him to the OR," Audra said. "He needs vascular surgery on that leg, and there's still blood in the chest cavity. Tell them what they're looking at before he comes through the door." She stepped back as the transport team moved in, watching them wheel Carter through the doors with the specific attention of someone making sure a handoff is complete before she lets herself stop. The second he was gone, her knee informed her it was done being patient. She found the instrument processing room by memory. She'd cleaned it enough times to know the layout without looking. She ran the water hot and stood at the sink, working the blood from her hands with the same methodical attention she always gave the task. Not because it required concentration, because it had been her way, since her second year in the field, of marking the end of something. Wash your hands. Let the water run. Move from what happened to what comes next. It wasn't working as well tonight. The heat on her skin pulled her backward instead of forward, past Mercy General, past the discharge office, all the way back to a mountainside where the cold had been specific and the dark had been complete. She'd washed her hands afterward in melt water and told herself the same thing she always told herself. You did what could be done. She was gripping the edge of the sink when the door opened behind her. Rhett stepped in, closed it, and stood a few feet back, giving her the room he'd always given her when a situation ended and the body needed a moment to catch up to that fact. He didn't fill the silence right away. When he spoke, he led with the thing that mattered most. "Carter's going to make it," Rhett said. "Surgeon says the leg's clean. Chest tube bought him exactly what he needed." Audra shut off the water and reached for the paper towels. "Good," she said. It was all there was to say. Rhett let the silence hold a moment before he went on. He told her what she'd already half understood, that they'd broken regulations to land here, that the nearest trauma center equipped for penetrating chest trauma was 40 minutes out by air, and Carter hadn't had 40 minutes. Then he told her the part she hadn't known. One of his team, a soldier named Davis, had taken a fragment round to the upper chest on a joint op 3 years back. Davis had tracked her career every year since people who'd been kept alive tend to keep track of the people who kept them. Davis had known she was here. Rhett had made the call. "You used me," Audra said. "Not anger. Something more considered than anger." "I used the fact that you were here," Rhett said. "There's a difference. You made the choice. Nobody dragged you out of that corner." Audra set the paper towels down. The knee had settled into a steady, dull presence, something she'd need to ice before the drive home. She thought about the corner she'd been standing in when the doors opened, about how precisely she'd calculated the distance from the cart to the wall, about 2 years of careful, deliberate invisibility that had ended in roughly 4 minutes of Carter's chest making sounds it shouldn't make. "I'm not Echo 6, she said. "Haven't been for 2 years. I have a float contract and a parking pass. I restock glove dispensers. That's what I am here." Rhett looked at her with the plain, undecorated attention of a man who wasn't going to pretend he hadn't just seen what he'd seen. "Call yourself whatever you want," he said. "You were Beacon the second you walked out from that wall. I don't think the name's actually what you're arguing about." He didn't push further. He reached into his jacket and set something on the edge of the sink. Her unit badge. The one she'd mailed back with the rest of her gear on her last day of outprocessing. Or believed she had. It was dented at one corner, with a rust-colored stain along the bottom edge that wasn't rust. He left without making more of it than it was. The badge sat there in the fluorescent light, while Audra looked at it for a long moment before turning away and heading back to the floor. The bay had been half cleaned. The litter was gone, the instrument tray moved to processing. What remained was the particular aftermath of something large having passed through, a smell the ventilation would need time to handle. People standing roughly where they'd been standing when it ended, not yet sure what to do with their hands. Marlene was at the station. Colin was writing. Desmond leaned against the wall, arms folded, the look of a man revising a much longer document in his head. Nobody said anything when Audra walked back in. The silence wasn't hostile. It was the silence of a room that had been rearranged and hadn't figured out yet how to describe itself. Desmond straightened. "Administration wants to meet," he said. "Tonight, if possible. Questions about the procedure, the authorization, the military involvement." He said it the way he'd report a lab result. "Here's the information. Here are the implications. Draw your own conclusions." The corridor connecting the main hospital to administration always ran a few degrees colder. Less HVAC, more the particular atmosphere of a room where institutional decisions get made. Audra had walked it twice before, both times alone, both times exactly what the paperwork said she was. Tonight, she walked it with Desmond a step ahead and Colin a step behind, an arrangement none of them had planned. The conference room already had 3 administrators seated, plus a risk management coordinator, the questions clearly prearranged. Authorization, scope of practice, what the hospital's liability looked like given that a non-credentialed staff member had performed a surgical procedure. Audra let the questions finish before she said anything. She'd learned in the field that the first person to speak in a tense room speaks from the wrong position. Desmond got there first anyway. He leaned into the table. "I was the attending physician on duty. Every clinical decision made in that bay tonight was made under my supervision. The patient presented with tension pneumothorax and hemorrhagic shock secondary to traumatic amputation. Time to deterioration was measured in minutes. What was done was the correct intervention, performed correctly, and the patient is currently stable in the OR." He didn't blink. "If there's a liability question, I'll answer it, as the physician who made the call. Because that's what I am." Colin slid his notebook across the table without a word. Timestamps, initial presentation, every clinical decision paired with its vital sign data, response time between intervention and stabilization. The kind of record a second-year resident makes when he's understood that what he witnessed needs to exist somewhere beyond memory. Then Marlene, who hadn't spoken yet, reached into a folder and set a set of documents on the table. Audra's military medical records, her training certifications. HR had required the full credentials package 2 years ago. Standard procedure. Marlene had gone back into that file sometime between Carter leaving for the OR and this meeting starting. She hadn't asked permission. She hadn't announced it. She'd simply retrieved what existed and put it where it needed to go. There was no apology in Marlene's face when she finally looked across the table. Audra didn't need one. She needed exactly what was sitting in front of her. The acknowledgement of someone who'd run her organizing principle straight into a wall and had chosen, without ceremony, to help clear the rubble. The meeting ended 30 minutes later without resolution and without further escalation, which, in administrative terms, meant it had gone about as well as it could have. Audra walked back through the cold corridor alone. The walk felt different this time. Not lighter, exactly. More honest, like a distance she was covering as herself, instead of the version of herself she'd edited for the room. The trauma bay was quieter by the time she got back. The night had kept going the way nights at Mercy General always kept going. New patients, new problems, the ongoing business of a floor that doesn't stop because something extraordinary happened in one corner of it. She found the N95 mask she'd dropped when the helicopters first came in, scattered near the supply cart, scuffed at the edges. The small radius of someone who'd set something down fast and not thought about it again. She crouched, gathered them, straightened, and stood under the fluorescent lights with the masks in her hand and the cart at her left. The knee ached. It would need ice and elevation before she slept, the same negotiation she'd been making with her own body for 2 years. The mountain was there too, the way it always was. Not sharp tonight, not overwhelming, just present, the way a scar is present whether you press on it or not. She wasn't going to be free of it by morning. She probably wasn't going to be free of it at any point she could currently foresee. She'd made a kind of peace with that. Not happiness. Sustainable. What she noticed, standing there, was that she wasn't trying to make herself small. She wasn't calculating the angles that kept her out of sight. The light was landing on her the same way it landed on everyone else in the room, and she was letting it. Marlene came out from the station. Administration wants a follow-up. Probably early next week. She looked at Audra with the eye of someone still mid-revision on a long-held position. They'll want to talk about your contract, too. Desmond's recommending a permanent placement if you want it. Audra set the masks back in the cart, aligned in the tray the way she always aligned them. I'm on shift till 6, she said. Someone needs to clean the bay from tonight. It's not back to standard. I'll have someone. I'll do it. The way she said it made it clear this wasn't self-punishment. It was just the next thing that needed doing, and she was the one here to do it. Marlene nodded, turned back toward the station, then stopped, her hand on the counter, back still to Audra. You should have had the tube kit, she said. The first time you asked. It was the closest Marlene Baird had come, in 20 years of running a trauma floor, to admitting she'd been wrong about something. No one died, Audra said. It was the only metric that had ever really mattered. Colin found her 20 minutes later, wiping down the bay with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. He stood in the doorway a moment before coming in, like he was deciding if what he had to say was worth the interruption. I didn't know what you were, he said finally. I knew you were a float nurse. That's all I knew. When you placed that line earlier, the one I couldn't get, he stopped, started over. I told myself you'd probably just gotten lucky. That's a thing people tell themselves when they don't want to update what they think of someone. Audra moved the cloth to the next surface. You're good with patience, she said. The kid with the wrist tonight, you were good with him. That's not nothing. Colin was quiet for a second. I'm going to be better at paying attention, he said. To who's actually in the room. To what they actually know. He said it like a commitment, not an apology, the kind that tends to stick. He left her to finish. By the time she was done, the bay looked the way it always looked, clean, ordered, ready for whatever came through the doors next. She stripped her gloves, washed her hands at the station sink, quick this time, functional instead of ritual. The badge was still in her scrub pocket. She'd picked it up on her way out of the instrument room. Not because she'd decided anything about it, but because leaving it there would have just been another way of pretending. Pretending she hadn't already understood what it meant. Pretending she could keep both versions of herself in separate rooms forever. She didn't put it on. She didn't put it anywhere else, either. It stayed in her pocket. That felt like the honest position. Not displayed, not discarded. Just present. The way the knee was present. The way the 6 years were present. Near the end of the shift, she passed the nursing station where 3 of the night staff sat charting. They looked up when she walked by, not the incurious glance they usually gave float nurses, the look that slides past you like furniture, but the attention of people still processing something, not quite finished with it. Audra met it without shortening her stride and kept walking. At the supply cart by the entrance, she stopped and nudged the mask tray flush with the shelf edge. A small habit, the kind of care that keeps a space ready for whoever needs it next. Marlene passed behind her. Follow-ups confirmed for Tuesday, 8 in the morning. I'll be here, Audra said. She looked down at the cart she'd been restocking when the windows first rattled and the night changed underneath her. Gloves stocked, tray aligned, everything in order. She thought about what Red had said in the instrument room. You were Beacon the second you walked out from that wall. And she thought about the fact that she hadn't walked out to become Beacon again. She'd walked out because Carter was dying, and she was the person who knew how to stop it. In that moment, those had been the only 2 facts that mattered. They were still true. They'd probably always be true. And for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't sure that was something to run from. She clipped her Mercy General badge back around her neck, ID facing out the way it always did. There was a bay to check before handoff. A drive home after that. An ice pack waiting. The fluorescent lights hummed at their usual frequency. The trauma bay was clean and ready. 2 floors up, Carter was in recovery with a surgical team's work holding him together. And in the pocket of a float nurse's scrub top, a dented unit badge sat quietly against her hip, not worn, not discarded, just carried.